The gun was already in John Conroy's hand before Violet Atwood even finished speaking. She had said 7 words. 7 simple words that no person in the entire valley of Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, had ever dared to say to him. Not in the 4 years since he had ridden in from wherever men like him rode in from. Not the sheriff, not the ranchers, not the drifters who came through smelling of trouble and left smelling of fear. Not one single soul. 7 words. You are afraid of being truly known. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had weight to it, the kind that pressed down on a room like a storm cloud sitting low on the mountains. The afternoon light came through the dusty window of the general store in slanted bars of gold, and every particle of dust seemed to freeze in place. Old Harlan Dupree behind the counter had gone so still he might have been carved from pine. The 2 cowboys near the door had stopped breathing. John Conroy stood 6 feet and 2 inches of hard muscle and harder experience. His dark hair was pushed back under a battered gray hat. His jaw was set like iron. His pale gray eyes, the color of winter sky right before a blizzard hits, were fixed on Violet Atwood with an expression no one in that room had a name for. The gun was the old Colt single-action army that never left his hip, and he had not drawn it in anger in over a year. He had drawn it now, not pointed, not cocked, just drawn the way a man draws a breath when something shocks the air out of his lungs. Violet Atwood did not flinch. She stood at the counter with a bolt of blue calico in her arms and a list of supplies written in neat handwriting on a folded piece of paper, and she looked at John Conroy the way a woman looks at a thing she has already figured out. Calm, steady. With something underneath the calm that was not fearlessness exactly, but rather the particular courage of someone who knows the truth and has decided the truth is worth the risk. She was 26 years old. She had arrived in Redemption Creek 4 days ago on the stage from Santa Fe. She had a small leather trunk, a carpet bag, and a letter of employment from the town's one schoolteacher, Miss Hattie Barlow, who had twisted her ankle badly and needed someone to manage the classroom for the coming season. 4 days. That was all Violet Atwood had been in this valley, and she had already read the most unreadable man in it. The gun went back in the holster. The motion was slow and deliberate, the kind of control that takes years to build, and John Conroy turned without a single word and walked out the door, and the bell above it rang out bright and sharp like a challenge. That was the moment. That was where everything truly began. To understand how Violet Atwood read John Conroy correctly on the very first day, you have to go back to the afternoon of her arrival in Redemption Creek. The stage from Santa Fe rolled in on a Thursday in late September of 1883, trailing a plume of red dust that the dry autumn wind carried sideways across the main street. Redemption Creek was not a large town. It had a main street that ran perhaps 300 yards, with the general store, a land office, a barbershop that doubled as a dentist's office, a small hotel called the Meridian, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, a livery stable, and a church with a bell tower that listed slightly to the east. Beyond Main Street, there were homes in various states of ambition, and beyond those, the wide open land that rolled away toward mountains in every direction. Violet stepped down from the stage and took a long breath of high desert air. It smelled of sage and horse and the particular dry sweetness of red earth, and it was completely unlike the thick, coal-smoked air of Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had lived until 8 months ago. She smoothed her dark gray traveling dress and lifted her carpet bag and looked at the street the way she looked at everything, with open attention, not cataloging danger, just receiving information. Miss Hattie Barlow was waiting at the stage stop. She was a small woman somewhere north of 50, with a strong face and an ankle wrapped thick in bandaging, leaning on a cane that looked freshly cut from a willow branch. "Miss Atwood," she said, and her handshake was firm despite everything. "I am grateful you came. The children are already 3 weeks behind." "I am grateful for the position," Violet said honestly. "How long do you expect the ankle to take?" The doctor says 6 to 8 weeks if I stay off it. I say we will see. Miss Barlow smiled with a kind of rueful self-knowledge. I am not a woman built for stillness. Violet helped with the bags, and they arranged for her trunk to be brought to the room Miss Barlow had secured for her at the Meridian Hotel. It was a small room, clean and spare, with a window that looked out over the back of the livery stable. But the mountains were visible beyond the rooftops, and that was enough. That first afternoon, Miss Barlow walked Violet slowly down the main street, pointing out the businesses and the people with the practiced efficiency of someone who had lived here long enough to know which information mattered. The Hendersons own the general store. Chester and me, good people, fair prices. The land office is Gerald Finch, not entirely trustworthy about boundaries but not a criminal. The Dusty Spur is run by a man named Burke Dolly. He keeps a mostly orderly house for a saloon. She paused in front of the barber shop. The families you will deal with most at the school are the Garcias, the Prentice family, the Wootons, and the Calloway family. Good children, mostly. The Calloway boys have some of the devil in them, but their mother is a wonderful woman and they are not bad at heart. Violet listened and stored everything. She had been doing this her whole life, receiving information about people and places and finding the patterns in it. Her mother had called it a gift. Her former employer in Cincinnati, a man who ran a small publishing house, had called it unsettling. Her closest friend, a woman named Clara, had called it the reason Violet was still unmarried at 26 in a world that expected women her age to have had 3 children by now. Violet called it simply paying attention. It was toward the end of this first walk, as the afternoon was slanting toward early evening and the light was going amber and warm, that she saw John Conroy for the first time. He was coming out of the livery stable on the opposite side of the street, leading a tall dark bay horse by the reins. He was in no hurry. He moved with the self-contained economy of a man who had long since stopped spending any motion on things that did not matter. He checked the saddle cinch with 2 practiced pulls, and then he swung up without using the stirrup, which was a thing that required considerable strength and ease, and the horse moved off down the street at a steady walk. Violet watched him for perhaps 6 seconds before she turned to Miss Barlow and said, "Who is that man?" Miss Barlow's expression shifted in a way that was interesting in itself. Not alarm, not disapproval, but something more like the careful neutrality of someone choosing words. "That is John Conroy. He manages the Calhoun Ranch, the largest spread in the valley, about 12 miles north. He has been here 4 years. Is he married? No. Has he ever been?" Miss Barlow gave her a slightly sideways look. "Not that anyone knows. He is a very private man, Miss Atwood. Possibly the most private man in the territory. People here have given up trying to know anything about him." She paused. "I would not read too much into the looking." "I am not reading into it," Violet said pleasantly. "I am reading him." Miss Barlow blinked. "I beg your pardon." But Violet was already thinking about the 6 seconds of observation she had just completed and what they had told her. She had noticed his hands first. They were capable and careful, the hands of someone who worked hard and took care of his tools, but there had been something in the way he checked that cinch, a brief additional check, a second pull when the first would have been sufficient. Not compulsive, careful. The check of a man who trusted nothing to chance, who had learned at some point in his life that the things you trusted to hold could fail you. She had noticed his eyes second, only for a moment as he glanced up the street before mounting, the pale gray of them visible even at that distance. They were scanning eyes, the kind that moved with quiet purpose, that took in every person on the street and filed each one away before returning to neutral. Not paranoid, alert. The eyes of a man who had lived in conditions where alertness was survival. She had noticed third the way he sat the horse when he rode away. Perfectly balanced, completely still in the saddle, and yet there was something held carefully at the center of him, a stillness that was not peace but containment. Like a man who had taken everything that hurt him and packed it down very tightly and put it in a place where he did not have to look at it directly. In 6 seconds, she had read the fundamental truth of John Conroy. He was afraid, not of physical danger, not of ordinary things. He was afraid of being found. Afraid of someone seeing past the containment and the careful alertness and the deliberate unreadability, and finding the thing underneath, which was a man who had been badly hurt by something or someone, and had never entirely recovered, and was not at all sure he wanted to. She thought about this through dinner at the small dining room of the Meridian Hotel and through the quiet of her first night in the high desert, listening to coyotes calling in the far dark, and she thought, this is a man who has made a fortress out of silence, and this is a man who is very lonely inside it. She did not pursue him. That was important. She was not a woman who pursued men, not from shyness, but because she had a fundamental respect for the pace at which people could be approached. She simply arrived in Redemption Creek and went about the business of becoming part of it. She met the children the following morning, Monday, 15 students ranging from age 6 to 14 in the one-room schoolhouse at the east end of Main Street. They were curious about her in the frank and slightly merciless way that children are curious about new adults. The Callaway boys, 8 and 10, tested her inside the first hour and found her utterly unmoved by their testing, which seemed to earn a kind of respect. The Garcia children were well prepared and eager. A quiet girl named Sarah Prentice, 12 years old, had a gift for reading that Violet recognized immediately and made a note to nurture. She established routines and expectations with quiet efficiency. She was not harsh, but she was clear, and children generally responded well to clarity. By the end of the first week, she had them back on schedule and working with something that looked like genuine engagement. She saw John Conroy twice in that first week. Once on the street when he rode through town on what appeared to be an errand related to the ranch, stopping briefly at the land office and then at the general store. The second time was at the Sunday service at the white-painted church, where he sat in the back pew on the left side, apart from the grouped families, and left before the final prayer with the quiet precision of a man who had calculated the exact minimum requirement for his presence in the community, and was fulfilling no more than that. She did not speak to him in that first week. She watched because watching was what she did, and what she saw added texture to the picture she had formed in those first 6 seconds. The town, she understood fairly quickly, had two feelings about John Conroy. There was respect for his competence. He managed the Calhoun Ranch with a skill that even people who disliked him acknowledged. The ranch had 500 head of cattle and employed 12 men, and under his management it ran with a discipline and efficiency that kept the Calhoun family, who lived in Denver and rarely came west, very satisfied with their investment. He was fair to his men in the ways that mattered, fair with wages, fair about the hard work, fair about the rare days of rest. They respected him even though, as Violet heard from me Henderson at the general store, he doesn't say much more than necessary, and he doesn't invite friendship, and he won't take it if you offer it. The second feeling was a kind of wary distance. People did not dislike John Conroy. They were simply uncertain of him in the way you were uncertain of weather that you could not predict. He made them feel slightly off balance because you could not read him, because every attempt to know him ran into the same smooth, high wall. And in a small community where knowing your neighbors was part of survival, an unreadable man was unsettling in a way that was hard to name. The sheriff, a solid and sensible man named Walt Aldridge, had told me Henderson, who had told at least 4 other people, that John Conroy was the best man in the valley to have on your side in any genuine emergency. He does not panic, Aldridge had said. He does not waste, and he will do what needs doing even if it costs him something. This was meant as high praise, and it was taken as such, but it also crystallized exactly what made him unnerving. A man who would do what needed doing even if it cost him something was a man who had gone a long way past ordinary human attachment to outcome, and going that far past it left marks. It was the end of the second week since Violet's arrival that brought her to the general store on that Thursday afternoon, That bright, clear October day with the sun coming through in golden bars, with the bolt of blue calico for the curtains in the schoolroom, which she was replacing because the old ones had grown so faded and dusty they seemed to absorb light rather than let it in. And John Conroy had been there when she arrived. He was at the counter, settling a supply order with Chester Henderson, and the transaction was brief and businesslike, and he had been about to leave when she came in. They had not exchanged a word yet, not in 2 weeks of both living in this valley. And perhaps that would have continued, this careful silence, because Violet was not a woman who forced encounters. But as John Conroy had turned to go, he had stepped around her to clear the narrow aisle between the barrels and the shelving, and for one moment they were within arm's reach of each other, and she had looked at him directly, and he had met her eyes. And in that moment, something happened that she had not quite predicted. His guard had dropped for a fraction of a second. Not much. A micro-expression, gone almost as fast as it appeared, in those pale gray eyes. Something that looked very much like recognition, as though some part of him had looked at her and registered a threat. Not physical threat, the threat of being seen. She had said it without really planning to say it. It had simply come out of her, the way observations sometimes did when they pushed against the inside of her thoughts too hard to stay quiet. You are afraid of being truly known. And the gun had come out and the room had frozen, and then John Conroy had put the gun away and walked out the door and the bell had rung. Chester Henderson let out a long, slow breath. One of the cowboys near the door exhaled and exchanged a glance with his companion. Violet placed her calico on the counter and smoothed it with both hands, and her heart was beating rather quickly, but her hands were steady. "Miss Atwood," Chester said, in the tone of a man who was not quite sure whether to be concerned or awed, "you might be the first person in 4 years who has said anything like that to that man and lived to complete the sentence." "He was not going to shoot me," Violet said. "He drew the gun because it was his instinct, and because he was frightened, and the gun is how he has trained himself to respond to things that frighten him. He put it away when he realized what he had done." Chester Henderson stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because he was more frightened of being right about what I said than he was angry about my saying it," Violet replied. "When a person is truly afraid of something, the emotion is fear, not rage. He was afraid." She folded her list and tucked it back into her pocket. "I will take the calico and the other items on my list, please, Mr. Henderson. I have a classroom to brighten up." The story of what Violet Atwood had said to John Conroy in the general store spread through Redemption Creek with the velocity that only small-town gossip can achieve. By that evening, the story had reached the Dusty Spur, the barber shop, and 3 separate households. By the following morning, it had made it to the outlying farms. By the afternoon of the second day, it had reached the Calhoun Ranch via one of the hands who had been in town. Violet heard about this spread through Miss Barlow, who received visitors throughout the day and had become something of an informal community news exchange. Miss Barlow's report was delivered with barely concealed admiration, because Miss Barlow had been in Redemption Creek for 14 years and had also never managed to penetrate the wall around John Conroy, though she had not tried as directly as Violet had. What Violet was not expecting was for John Conroy to come to the schoolhouse. He came on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after the incident in the general store. The children had gone home. Violet was at the chalkboard erasing the day's arithmetic lesson when she heard the door open and turned and found him standing in the doorway, hat in his hand, which was itself a kind of surrender, the small social ceremony of removing the hat, the acknowledgement of being somewhere that required a different kind of self. He was not comfortable. That was clear. He stood in the doorway the way a man stands when he has committed to coming somewhere and has not yet committed to staying, weight balanced slightly toward the outside, as if he might yet turn and go without disgrace. Violet set down her eraser and waited. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who chose words the way a prudent person chose footing on uncertain ground. Drawing a weapon in a public building over words is not a thing a decent man does. I accept your apology, Violet said, though I should also offer one. It was not my place to say that to a stranger. His jaw tightened fractionally. Was it true? The question surprised her. Not because it was unexpected from a man of his intelligence, but because of the raw quality of it, the way he had cut straight to the thing that actually mattered. She had not expected him to ask it. She had expected him to take the apology exchange and leave. I believe it was, she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat slowly in both hands, looking at the floor between them, and then he looked up and those pale gray eyes were entirely unguarded for just 1 second, and what she saw in them made her chest ache with a kind of tenderness she had not expected. You have been here 2 weeks, he said, and it was not quite an accusation. It was more like a man holding up a fact and not knowing what to do with it. 14 days, she agreed. How? She considered how to answer. I pay attention, she said finally. I have done it my whole life. It is not mystical. It is simply observation and pattern, and a willingness to sit with what the patterns tell you rather than revising them to be more comfortable. She paused. You move through this town like a man who is very careful about what he shows and very practiced at showing nothing. But the care itself is a tell. You are not unreadable. You are a man working very hard at being unreadable, and the work is visible to someone looking for it. John Conroy stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, What else did you see? It was a question she had not anticipated. It was also the bravest question she had heard a man ask in a long time. You are lonely, she said, and said it gently. You are lonely in a way that has gone on for a long time, and has become so familiar that you have probably stopped identifying it as loneliness and started calling it preference. He put his hat back on. She thought he was leaving. Instead, he walked into the room and sat down in one of the adult-sized chairs near the window, the chair that was normally used when a parent came to discuss a child's progress, and he looked out the window at the street for a moment and then back at her. I was going to say that you are wrong, he said, but she said. But I cannot figure out why I would bother lying to a woman who already knows the truth, he said, and there was something almost like wry humor in it, very dry and very small, but it was there. Violet pulled her own chair from behind the desk and sat down, and they talked for an hour. It was not easy conversation. It was the careful, tentative conversation of 2 people crossing a new bridge, testing each board before committing full weight. He did not tell her anything about his past that day. She did not ask. They talked about the valley, about the ranch, about the children she was teaching. He asked about Cincinnati, and she told him a few things, the way the city smelled, the publishing house, the reason she had finally decided to answer an advertisement for a temporary teaching position in New Mexico territory. Why here? He asked. Truly. Because it was as far away from the life I was living as I could reasonably get, she said, and was surprised to find herself matching his honesty with her own. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in the attentiveness of someone processing something important. What were you running from? A proposal, she said. A very sensible, very appropriate proposal from a very sensible, very appropriate man, and the absolute terror of saying yes to it and spending the rest of my life in rooms where I had already figured out everything and everyone and there would be nothing left to learn. Something shifted in his face, very small, the ghost of recognition. You understand that, she said. It was not a question. He stood up and put his hat straight and said, I will let you finish your work, Miss Atwood. But at the door he paused and said, without turning back, Thank you for the apology. And he walked out into the October afternoon, and this time the bell above the door did not ring like a challenge. It rang almost like an answer to one. October moved through the valley in stages of gold and rust, the aspens on the mountain slopes going brilliant and then falling, the days still warm under a deep blue sky and the nights dropping quickly toward cold. Violet settled into the rhythm of Redemption Creek, with the practical adaptability that had always been her great survival skill. Learning the names of every family, the particular geography of each child's strengths and difficulties, the small and large politics of a small community that contained within its borders all the complexity that any human community always contains. She saw John Conroy in town twice a week on average, because the ranch required regular supply runs, and because he served, she learned, as an informal point of communication between the Calhoun interests and the town's business community. Each time they encountered each other now, he acknowledged her. Not much. A brief nod, a short word. But it was a marked change from before, when he had passed through town like a man who did not quite admit the existence of anyone in it. The third week of October, he offered to help her bring a heavy case of books from the stage depot to the schoolhouse. The case had arrived from Santa Fe, ordered from a catalog publisher in St. Louis. It was genuinely heavy, and Violet had been calculating how best to manage it with the help of two of her older students. And then John Conroy had materialized at her elbow and picked the case up without apparent effort and carried it to the schoolhouse and set it down where she indicated, and then stood with his arms loose at his sides, looking at the shelves she had already arranged. "You have more books than the town store has goods," he said. "Books are provisions," she said. "You cannot think properly without them." He picked up a volume that was lying on the desk. It was a well-worn copy of a book of essays by Emerson. He read a few lines, turned the page, read a few more. "Set it down. Do you read much?" she asked. "When I can find things worth reading," he said. "Ranch supply records get old," she laughed. It surprised him. She could see it in the slight shift of his expression, something a little unguarded, as though laughter was something he had not been in close proximity to in a while, and its sudden warmth had caught him off guard. "You may borrow the Emerson if you like," she said. "He is worth reading." He picked the book up again, looked at the cover, set it back down. "I will bring it back." "I know you will," she said simply. He left without the book. It sat on her desk for 2 days, and on the third day she came in to find it gone and a neatly folded note in its place that said only, "Thank you." JC. She kept the note. She was aware that this was a sentimental thing to do and did it anyway. November came in on a cold wind from the north that swept out the last of the autumn warmth and left the valley braced and clear, the mountains snow-capped, the ground frozen in the mornings, and the cottonwoods along the creek stripped to bare silver branches. The children came to school in heavier coats, and some of them had a long ride in the cold, and Violet made sure the small iron stove in the schoolhouse was lit early every morning. John Conroy returned the Emerson on the first Saturday of November. He came to the schoolhouse on a Saturday because he had correctly calculated that she would be there grading papers, which she was. He sat in the same chair by the window and they talked for 2 hours this time, and this time the conversation was different, looser, less like crossing an uncertain bridge and more like discovering that the bridge had been solid all along. He told her about the cattle. Not superficially, not the practical ledger of livestock numbers and grazing rotation, but the real things, the way the Hereford bulls had changed the quality of the herd over 3 years of careful crossing, the particular intelligence of certain individual animals that most people did not credit cattle with having. He talked about it with a quiet enthusiasm that he clearly did not often indulge, and she listened with genuine interest, and she asked questions that were good enough questions that he looked at her with a brief surprised expression that was almost wonderful in what it revealed. "You actually want to know," he said, "not quite a question." "Yes," she said. "Tell me about the grazing rotation." He did, and she listened, and something was changing between them, slowly and carefully, and with the particular sweetness of things that are allowed to develop at their own pace rather than forced. She told him about the publishing house, about her time in Cincinnati, which had been in many ways a good life, comfortable and ordered and intellectually satisfying in some ways, but which had left her with a growing and eventually intolerable feeling of being slightly too large for the space she had been assigned. She told him about the proposal from Edmund Vane, the attorney, who was kind and stable and utterly without surprises. She told him she had said no and that Edmund had been genuinely bewildered and genuinely hurt, and that she felt guilty about the hurt but not about the decision, and she was still working out whether that made her a selfish person or simply an honest one. An honest one, John said, without hesitation. She looked at him. A selfish person would have said yes to get the security, he said, and spent the rest of her life resenting a decent man. That would have been the selfish choice. He looked at the window. Honesty takes more courage than people give it credit for. That sounds like someone who has had to be honest about something difficult, she said. He was quiet. She let the quiet stand. She was good at that, at not filling silences that belonged to someone else. After a while he said, I left a situation in Kansas 7 years ago, a ranch where I had been foreman for 3 years. The owner was a man named Garrick Holt. He had a daughter, Clara. We were to be married. He stopped. She waited. She told me 3 days before the wedding that she had been seeing someone else for the previous year, a man from a banking family in Wichita. She had been trying to choose, and she had chosen him. He turned the hat in his hands once, twice. The part that I could not get past for a long time was not the loss of her. I grieved that and moved through it. The part I could not get past was not having known. 3 years, I thought I knew her. I thought I understood what she was. I did not see what was right in front of me. He looked at Violet. That is a particular kind of damage, the damage of discovering you cannot trust your own reading of people. The room was very still. The stove ticked quietly with heat. So you stopped trying to read anyone, Violet said softly. And you made sure no one could read you. If you keep everyone far enough away, he said, no one can surprise you. No, she agreed, but no one can reach you either. He looked at her for a long moment, and those pale gray eyes held something she had not seen in them before, something raw and careful and tentative, the expression of a man standing at the edge of a decision he had long since convinced himself he would never make again. He stood up and said he had to get back to the ranch before dark, and she said of course, and he went to the door, and this time he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back and said, Miss Atwood. Yes. Would you be willing to ride out to the ranch next Saturday? I could show you the herd. The mountain view from the north pasture is. He stopped, tried again. It is a good view. She let herself smile. She could not help it. I would like that very much, Mr. Conroy. He nodded. He left. She sat for a moment in the now empty schoolhouse with the stove ticking and the satisfaction of having done something right settling warmly in her chest. Miss Barlow, when Violet mentioned the invitation, looked at her over the rim of her teacup with an expression that combined delight and astonishment in equal measure. John Conroy has never invited anyone to the ranch, she said, in 4 years. I know, Violet said. You do not seem very surprised. He was ready, Violet said simply. Sometimes people are ready before they know they are. They just need someone to make the invitation make sense to them. Miss Barlow set down her cup. Her ankle was improving. She was getting around better now, with the cane only for longer distances. She looked at Violet with the particular expression of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize the early stages of something real when she sees them. Be careful with him, she said, and her voice was entirely gentle. Not for your sake, for his. I think he is the kind of man who, if he lets someone in again, will let them in all the way. I know that too, Violet said quietly. The Saturday visit to the Calhoun Ranch was one of those days that lodge themselves in memory with unusual completeness, so that years later you can still recall the particular quality of the light, and the exact temperature of the air, and the things that were said, and the things that were not said but were present anyway. The day was cold and bright, a deep blue November sky, and the sage-dotted land rolling away from the ranch buildings toward mountains that wore their snow like a deliberate statement. John rode alongside Violet, who had borrowed a horse from the livery, a steady chestnut mare named Copper that accommodated Violet's moderate riding skills with patient good nature. He pointed things out as they rode, the water sources, the natural barriers that shaped the grazing areas, the new fence line along the eastern boundary. His men, the 12 hands who worked the ranch, were courteous and curious, and somewhat visibly astonished. Violet later learned from Me Henderson, who had heard it from the wife of one of the hands at church, that the hands had held a debate on the subject of what John Conroy was doing bringing a woman out to the ranch. The debate had been good-natured and had concluded with general agreement that something very unusual was happening and that it was probably good for him. The north pasture was everything he had promised. The mountains rose from the flat land in one dramatic movement, and the snow line was clean and brilliant against the blue sky, and the herd moved in the middle distance with that particular bovine gravity that is oddly beautiful in the right light. They sat their horses on the small rise and did not say anything for a while, and the silence was entirely comfortable. "You were right," she said. "It is a good view. The best in the valley, I think," he said, "though the East Ridge has a case for it at sunrise." "I will take your word for it." She looked sideways at him. His profile in the bright cold air was clean and strong, and she had the thought, not for the first time, that he was an extraordinarily handsome man in the way that had nothing to do with prettiness and everything to do with the kind of face that is built by character. He turned and found her looking and did not look away. The moment stretched a little, warm in the cold air. "Violet," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice did something she had not quite prepared for. "Yes," she said. He seemed to reconsider whatever he had been about to say, and then decided to say it anyway, which she recognized as a small act of courage for him. "I have been thinking since we first talked about the thing you said to me in the store, that I was afraid of being known." He looked at the mountains. "You were correct, and I want you to know that being correctly read by someone who did not flinch from what she saw is both the most frightening thing that has happened to me in years." And he stopped. "And," she said gently, "and the most relief I have felt in a very long time," he said. "The exhausting thing about being unreadable is that it never stops requiring effort." She turned her horse to face him. "You do not have to be unreadable to me," she said. "I am not going to use what I see to harm you." "I know that," he said, and the simple directness of it, the trust inherent in the knowing, was extraordinary. "I know that already. That is what is strange. I know that already." They rode back to the ranch house, and she was introduced properly to the cook, a weathered Mexican man named Ernesto Cruz, who had cooked for the ranch for 8 years and who greeted Violet with a dignified warmth, and then produced a lunch that was far better than any reasonable person expected from a ranch kitchen. They ate at the table in the ranch house's main room, a solid room with good furniture and absolutely nothing decorative. No curtains, no pictures, nothing on the walls except a map of the ranch property and a calendar. Violet looked at the bare walls and did not comment. After lunch he walked her to her horse and held Copper's bridle while she mounted, and he looked up at her and said, "Will you come again?" "Yes," she said, and did not make him ask twice. December came and the valley pulled inward against the cold, and the community drew tighter in the way that cold communities always do, with more evenings by fires and more meals shared, and more of the small social rituals that mark the difference between neighbors and strangers. Violet taught her children through December with a steady good humor that the cold could not diminish, and she spent her evenings in the Meridian or at Miss Barlow's house, which had become a kind of informal center of her social life. She saw John Conroy every Saturday now, alternating between her riding out to the ranch and him coming to town. In town they walked and talked and occasionally had dinner at the small restaurant that the Meridian provided. At the ranch they rode or sat in the main room and talked over coffee while the fire worked against the December cold. The walls of the ranch house's main room acquired, over December, a series of small changes. First, a set of curtains that Violet simply brought one Saturday because she had made them from a bolt of sturdy red wool, and the bare windows had been bothering her more than she could justify. John had looked at the curtains when she hung them without a word, but she had caught him looking at them 3 separate times in the following 2 hours, with an expression she recognized as the expression of a man encountering something unexpectedly pleasant that he did not have a category for. The second change was a print of the mountain range that she found at the general store, a decent reproduction of a landscape painting, and she brought it on a subsequent Saturday with a small nail and Chester Henderson's borrowed hammer. John had watched her hang it and said, "You are decorating my house." "I am making it warmer," she said. "There is a fire." "There is now also a picture," she said serenely. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Where would you put a second one?" She turned to look at him. He was looking at the wall with the map, his arms crossed, his head tilted slightly, considering. "There," she said, pointing to the space between the map and the window, "if you find another one worth having." "I will look," he said. She turned away so he would not see her smile, and then decided she did not want to hide it from him and turned back, and he was already looking at her, and the smile she had been trying to conceal was perfectly visible, and his face did the thing it was increasingly doing around her, the small relaxation of his expression, the ghost of warmth in those pale eyes, and she thought with a completeness that surprised her, "I am falling in love with this man." She sat with this knowledge for several days before she was entirely certain it was true, and not merely the persuasive story her own intelligence was telling her about a pattern she found interesting. She tested it the way she tested everything, by examining it from uncomfortable angles. Was it pity? No. She respected him too deeply for pity and found him too entirely real for that particular soft condescension. Was it the romance of the project, the wounded man who needed fixing? She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge the risk of that particular trap, but when she held it up to the light she found something different. She was not attracted to his damage. She was attracted to what existed alongside his damage, his dry and careful humor, his fierce intelligence about the things he chose to apply it to, the deep-running honesty of him, the essential kindness that sat underneath the containment, visible in the way he treated his men and his horse and old Ernesto, and the rare moments when his guard was entirely down. She was in love with John Conroy the man, not the story of him. Having established this to her own satisfaction, she continued exactly as she had been, because she was also a patient woman, and she understood that the pace of this particular thing was not hers to set. He had to arrive at what he felt by his own road. She could not carry him there. Christmas in Redemption Creek in 1883 was celebrated with the modest and genuine warmth of a small community that had decided to make the best of a long winter. The church held a service on Christmas Eve with the children's choir, which included 4 of Violet's students, and the school had held its own small celebration the last week of term, with the children performing their recitations and showing their best work and accepting their small gifts of candy and books with great and unself-conscious delight. John Conroy came to the school's Christmas celebration. He sat in the back and watched the children recite and said nothing. But afterward, when the room had emptied of families taking their children home, he stayed and helped Violet stack the chairs and told her that the prentice girl, Sarah, had recited her poem with a quality that was beyond what he had expected from a child of 12. "She is extraordinary," Violet said, and the warmth in her voice when she talked about her students was one of the things he had noticed about her, the way she held her care for them without apology, openly, the way she held all of her feelings. "She reads at a level 3 years beyond her age, and she understands what she reads. She is going to need opportunities that this valley may not be able to provide. Have you spoken to her parents about it?" "I intend to in the new year. Her father is a practical man and her mother is ambitious for her children in the best way. I think they will hear it." She looked at him. "I am thinking about writing to a women's college. There are programs now for younger students who show exceptional ability. If I can document her performance properly, you would advocate for her," he said. "I would," she said. "Is that unusual?" "It is not usual," he said carefully, "for someone to be new to a place and already committed enough to its people to put effort into their futures." She looked at him directly. "I am committed to this place," she said. "I do not think I am temporary anymore. I think this is where I am meant to be." She held his gaze. Do you understand what I am telling you? He held her gaze for a long moment and then he said very quietly, "Yes," and he reached out and took her hand. It was a brief touch, his hand covering hers where it rested on the back of a stacked chair, warm and certain and entirely intentional, and then he released it and stepped back and said good night, and she stood in the empty schoolroom with her heart hammering in her chest and an enormous, helpless smile on her face, and she thought, there it is. Christmas Day he arrived at the Meridian Hotel with a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside was a book, a collection of the complete works of Shakespeare, a beautiful edition with good printing and a leather binding, with his name written in the front in the careful handwriting of someone who had taught himself to write well as an adult and had the slight formality that showed. He had written, "For Violet Atwood, who has more books than Henderson's has goods, and yet did not have this one." JC she gave him a gift as well. She had spent considerable thought on it. She had found, through correspondence with a bookseller in Santa Fe, a book on cattle breeding and rangeland management published the previous year by an agricultural college in the East, a practical and serious text that represented the newest thinking on exactly the kind of work he was doing on the Calhoun Ranch. She had ordered it 3 weeks prior, and it had arrived just in time. He turned it over in his hands and read the title and looked up at her. "Where did you find this?" "Santa Fe bookseller," she said. "I described what I was looking for and he found it. Violet." He said her name the way he was learning to say it now, with a simple directness that was entirely different from how he had said everything before she arrived in his life. "This is," he stopped, started again. "This is very thoughtful. You are doing important work," she said. "The kind of work that ought to have good information behind it." He held the book in both hands and looked at her and said nothing for a moment, and what was in his face was something she had not seen there before, and it made her look away briefly because it was almost too much, the expression of a man receiving something he had not expected to deserve. January arrived in the valley like a statement of intent, cold and uncompromising, the mountains buried deep in snow, the creek running dark between frozen edges, the sky low and gray for days at a time. Violet kept the school going through the cold with the iron stove and determination, and on the days when the weather made the longer rides dangerous, she kept only the town children and sent word to the outlying families to keep their children home. John Conroy came to town through the January cold with a regularity that people in Redemption Creek noticed and commented upon. He had always come when the ranch required it. Now he came when the ranch required it and when it did not. On the Saturday afternoons when the weather allowed, they walked or rode together, and on the Saturday afternoons when the weather did not allow, they sat by the fire in the Meridian's small parlor and talked. The quality of their conversations had deepened steadily through December and January into something that was both easy and significant, the kind of conversation that is possible only between people who have decided to be genuinely honest with each other, and have found that honesty to be survivable and worth continuing. He told her about Kansas, more than the brief account he had given in November. He told her about the years before Kansas, about growing up in Missouri on a small farm with a father who was a hard man in all the ways that hardness in a parent damages children, who had not been cruel in any dramatic way, but who had been entirely closed, a man who treated emotion as weakness and closeness as liability, and who had produced in his son a deep and practiced capacity for distance that John had carried all the way through his 20s believing it to be strength. "It took me a long time to understand that I had confused the two things," he said. "Distance and strength, they are not the same. Distance is just distance." "Your father," she said carefully, "is he still living?" "He died 8 years ago. I went back for the funeral. There were 5 people at the grave, including me and the minister. He was quiet. I cried on the ride home and was angry at myself for crying because I was not sure whether I was crying for him or for the father he had not been, and one of those things seemed more legitimate than the other." "They are both legitimate," she said. He looked at her. "You believe that?" Yes, she said firmly, grief is not an exactness. You do not have to have had a perfect relationship with someone to grieve the loss of the possibility of it. He was very still. And then he said, with a roughness in his voice that he allowed to be there, which itself was remarkable, "That is the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me about it." She reached across and put her hand on his arm, not the brief careful touch of Christmas, but a full and deliberate placement of her hand, and he looked at it, and then he turned his arm and took her hand and held it, and they sat like that for a while in the firelit parlor while the January cold pressed against the windows and could not get in. February was when everything between them moved from the careful and tentative to the direct and certain. It happened on the second Saturday of the month. They had ridden out toward the foothills, a longer ride than usual, because the day had decided to be warm for February, the kind of fall spring warmth that the high desert offers sometimes as a cruelty or a gift, and neither of them had wanted to waste it. They found a place on a south-facing slope where the sun had cleared the snow from a ledge of flat rock, and they tied the horses and sat on the rock in the February sun with the valley spread below them, and the mountains immense and white behind. John had been quiet for the first part of the ride, in a way that was different from his usual quiet. The usual quiet was ease and comfort, the quiet of someone who no longer needed to fill every space with words. This quiet had something underneath it, a decision being made or unmade, a weight being carried toward a place. She gave him the silence. She was good at that. After a long time he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly, not like a man who is afraid of the answer but like one who has decided the question is worth more than the fear." "All right," she said. He turned to face her on the flat rock, and those pale gray eyes were entirely clear and steady, the way eyes look when a person has made a decision all the way through. "Would you be willing to consider a future with me?" he said. "I am not a simple man to be with, I know that. I have a great deal of practice being closed off and a limited amount of practice being otherwise. I will get it wrong sometimes, but I will not hide from you and I will not be dishonest with you, and I am—" his voice changed very slightly. "I am deeply in love with you, and I have been for a long time. And I think you know that, because you are you. But I wanted to say it plainly rather than assume you had simply read it correctly and file it away in the category of things we both know." Violet Atwood, who was not a woman given to easy tears, felt something behind her eyes that she was not going to let become tears, not because she was embarrassed by them, but because she was too happy to cry and the happiness was winning. "Yes," she said, "I would be very willing to consider a future with you." She paused. "And I have been in love with you since at least November, if we are being precise about timelines." The expression that moved across his face in response to this was one she had never seen there before, unguarded and warm and luminous in a way that changed every line of it. He reached up and touched her face, cupped her jaw with one careful hand, and kissed her, and it was a simple and serious kiss, the kind that belongs to people who have come a long road to get to it and know what they have arrived at. The valley below them shone silver-white in the February sun, and the mountains watched from their immense distance, and everything was exactly as it should be. They rode back to Redemption Creek in the late afternoon light, with the easy closeness of people who have passed from one stage of themselves into another, and are entirely comfortable with where they have landed. John kept his horse close alongside hers on the road, and their knees were almost touching, and neither of them pulled away. "When," he said after a while, she glanced at him. "When what? When did you know precisely?" "November, you said." When in November? She thought about it. "The Saturday you came back with the Emerson and sat in the chair by the window and told me about Kansas, about Clara." She looked at the road ahead. Not because of the story itself, because of the bravery it took to tell it. He was quiet for a moment. "You love bravery in people." "I love honesty," she said, "and honesty requires bravery, so yes, inevitably." He nodded slowly, and she could see him taking this apart and examining it, which was something she loved about him, the way he took things seriously, the way he engaged with what was actually being said rather than the surface of it. "I was frightened of you from the first day," he said. "I want you to know that I know I was. You said it in the store and you were right, and I have spent months understanding why you were right, but I knew it the moment you stepped off that stage." She turned quickly to look at him. "You saw me get off the stage. I was coming out of the livery," he said simply. "You looked at the town, and then you looked at the mountains, and then you looked directly at me, and I had the absolute conviction that you were going to see things I had been a long time hiding." He kept his eyes on the road. "I was not wrong." She was quiet for a moment. And now," he said, "I am grateful to have been seen." The spring engagement of Violet Atwood and John Conroy was announced on a Sunday in March when John stood up at the end of the church service, which was a thing he had never done in the 4 years of his attendance, and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the building that he intended to marry Miss Atwood, and he thought the community that had, in its various ways, contributed to this outcome deserved to know about it. The response was immediate and warm. "Me," Henderson cried, which surprised her husband and delighted her. Sheriff Walt Aldridge shook John's hand with the genuine enthusiasm of a man who had spent 4 years hoping this particular individual would find a way to be human before he turned too hard to manage it. Miss Barlow sat in her pew with her healing ankle and her cane, and a smile that could have lit the church without candles. The Calloway boys, 8 and 10 years old, wanted to know if there would be cake at the wedding. Violet promised there would. The wedding was set for May, which gave time for the weather to cooperate and for the necessary arrangements to be made. Violet wrote to her family in Cincinnati, a mother and a younger brother, both of whom she loved and had been somewhat brief in her correspondence with, engaged as she had been in the business of building a new life. Her mother wrote back with a letter that managed simultaneously to express significant relief at the news of an engagement, genuine concern about the distance of New Mexico territory, and a great deal of questions about John Conroy's character and prospects. Violet wrote back a long letter, longer than most of her letters, describing John with the precision she applied to everything, his history as she knew it, his character as she had come to know it, the specific and particular qualities that made him the person she had chosen, and she sent it knowing her mother would read it carefully and would understand what it said between the lines as well as in the lines themselves. Her mother was, after all, where she had got the tendency for careful observation. John wrote a letter to her mother as well, on his own initiative, without telling Violet he was doing it. She found out when her mother mentioned it in a subsequent letter, a brief and proper letter from a man who had clearly thought carefully about every word and had chosen to say, in his careful and precise way, that he understood what he was asking of her mother in taking her daughter so far from home, and that he intended to take very good care of her for the rest of his life, and that he believed she would be happy. Her mother wrote to Violet, "He is formal in his letters, but there is something underneath the formality that I trust. I think you have found someone worthy of you. Do not lose him to the wilderness." The spring was warm and building towards summer, and the valley was startlingly green in the way that high desert goes green after winter, sudden and vivid. Violet continued teaching through April with the energy of someone who has found the right place to be and is no longer spending any resources on wondering about it. The children were aware of the change in their teacher, not in any way that disrupted the school's work, but in the general warmth of the atmosphere, which improved alongside everything else. Miss Barlow's ankle had healed fully by March, and she resumed some duties at the school, working alongside Violet in a partnership that suited both of them. Miss Barlow had spent 14 years alone in that schoolroom, and found the company an unexpected pleasure. Violet found in Miss Barlow a woman of sharp intelligence and deep commitment to the Valley's children, and the two of them redesigned the curriculum together over a series of long February and March evenings, and produced something better than either would have alone. Sarah Prentice's parents received Violet's assessment of their daughter with the thoughtful seriousness it deserved. Her father, a quiet man named Robert Prentice who ran a small farm east of town, had listened to everything Violet said and then asked precise and practical questions about costs and distances and scholarship possibilities. Her mother, Ellen, had wept a little and then straightened up and said that if her daughter had the ability, they would find the way to support it. Violet had already written to 2 institutions, and by April she had a letter back from a women's college preparatory program in St. Louis that accepted exceptional applicants from rural territories and offered a substantial scholarship based on merit examinations. The day Violet told Sarah Prentice that there was a real and documented path from the schoolroom in Redemption Creek to something larger, the girl sat very still for a moment and then said, in a small and serious voice, "You did that for me." "You earned it," Violet said. "I just made sure the road was visible." The wedding day was a Saturday in late May, warm and clear, with the mountains green-shouldered now and the valley in full flower. The church had been decorated by several women of the community, with whatever spring flowers could be cut from gardens and gathered from the fields, columbines and wild roses, and the small yellow flowers that grew along the creek. And the result was genuine and lovely in the way that handmade things done with real care always are. Violet wore a dress of blue-gray silk that she had ordered from Santa Fe, and that fit her well and made her eyes look like deep water. Her dark hair was done up with a simplicity that suited her, and she wore no jewelry except a small pin at her collar that had been her grandmother's. John Conroy in a good dark suit was, she decided privately, one of the most handsome sights she had encountered in her life. He stood at the front of the church with the controlled stillness that was his nature and watched her walk down the aisle with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, because it was entirely unguarded. Every wall down, everything visible. The love in it and the terror in it and the fierce and absolute resolution in it all at once, naked on his face in front of every person in the valley, and she understood what that cost him and loved him more for it. The minister, a thoughtful man named Reverend Baines, spoke simply and well. When he asked John if he took Violet Atwood to be his wife, John said yes in a voice that was quiet but carried to every corner of the church. And when he asked Violet the same question, she said yes with equal quiet and equal certainty. And Reverend Baines married them before God and the assembled community of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, on a perfect May morning in 1884. There was, as promised, considerable cake. The summer of their first year of marriage was a season of discovery, not the dramatic discovery of who a person was, because Violet had known who John Conroy was since the second month of their acquaintance, but the detailed and intimate discovery of how to build a shared life with someone. This was a different kind of knowing, domestic and practical and layered with small dailiness. And it was, she found, exactly as rewarding as the larger knowing. She moved into the ranch house, which underwent a quiet and steady transformation over the summer months. Not dramatic. Violet was not a dramatic decorator. But a house that had been a place to sleep and eat became, under her care, and with John's increasingly active participation, a home. More curtains, more pictures, more books. A small garden in the back that she planted with herbs and a few flowers, practical and cheerful both. A proper table in the dining room and chairs that matched, replacing the mismatched assortment that the previous occupant had left. John watched these transformations with the attentiveness he brought to everything and occasionally contributed to them, coming home one day with a rocking chair for the porch, another day with a piece of blue and white crockery that had caught his eye at the general store, which was remarkable because it was the first decorative purchase he had ever made for the house, and it made Violet so happy she kissed him right there in the kitchen in front of Ernesto Cruz, who pretended to be very busy with the stove. There were also discoveries of the harder kind, the moments when the pattern of a marriage revealed the places where two people's particular histories and habits rubbed against each other. John's deeply ingrained tendency toward internal processing, toward taking difficult things inside and sitting with them alone before bringing them out, was the one that created the most friction, because Violet was the opposite in this. someone who thought by talking, and who experienced his silences in difficult moments as distance rather than process. The first significant disagreement of their marriage was about exactly this. A business matter had come up at the ranch, a dispute with the Calhoun family's Eastern representative about the terms of the upcoming year's arrangement, and John had spent 3 days carrying the weight of it without saying anything, and Violet had felt the weight without knowing what it was, and by the 3rd day had asked him directly what was wrong, and he had said nothing in a way that was not dishonest, but was not the openness he had promised her. She had said quietly and without anger, "You are doing the thing you promised you would not do." He had looked at her. "What thing?" "Hiding," she said. "Not deliberately. I know it is not deliberate. But you have been carrying something for 3 days, and I have been standing next to you, and you have not let me stand next to it." There was a long pause. Then he said, "I am sorry. It is the old habit. It is easier to handle things alone." "I know it is easier," she said. "That is exactly the problem. You trained yourself to handle everything alone because you had to, and now you do not have to, and the habit does not know that yet." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "The Calhoun representative is trying to renegotiate the management terms in a way that would reduce my authority over hiring decisions. It is a serious issue, and I have been trying to work out the right response before bringing it to you because I did not want to worry you with something I had not yet solved. I am your wife," she said. "I do not need you to solve things before bringing them to me. I need you to bring them to me." He heard this. She could see him hear it. And then he told her everything about the dispute, the full detail of it, and she sat across the table from him and listened. And then she said, "Write to the Calhoun family directly, not through the representative. You have 4 years of results behind you. The results are your argument." It was the right suggestion. He wrote the letter, and 2 weeks later had a reply from Denver that confirmed his authority in full and informed him that the representative had been reminded of his proper role. John told Violet the outcome over dinner and then said, "You were right about bringing it to you. 2 minds were better than 1. 4 hands for the work," she said, which was something her grandmother had said about marriage. He turned it over as he did with things he found worth keeping. 4 hands for the work," he repeated. And he reached across the table and took both of hers. The disagreements after that were the ordinary ones of a marriage between 2 strong-minded people, present and worked through, and never the kind that left damage behind. They were getting better at it steadily, which was the point. Marriage was a practice, not a destination, and both of them understood that well enough to not expect perfection. In October of 1884, a year after Violet's arrival in Redemption Creek, she told John that she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday evening, the kind of quiet Sunday evening that had become the texture of their shared life, sitting on the porch in the last of the October warmth, with the mountains going purple in the dusk. He went still in the way he went still for things that were very large. Then he turned to look at her, and his face held the same expression she had seen on their wedding day, everything down, everything visible, the love and the terror and the absolute resolution. "When?" he said. "Late spring," she said. "May or June, the doctor thinks." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and the mountains darkened slowly in the dusk, and the first stars came out over the high desert, and the silence between them was the deepest and most comfortable silence she had ever known. She had been right about him on the very first day, when she had read him in 6 seconds on the main street of a small town she had just arrived in. She had been right about the loneliness and the fear and the fortress of silence, and the man inside it who was worth reaching. What she had not been able to read on that first day, because it was not yet true, was what he would become in the presence of being known. She had seen the outline. She had not seen the fullness. That had taken the months and the conversations and the winter walks and the ranch visits and the Christmas books and the February rock in the February sun and the wedding day and every ordinary extraordinary morning since. He had become, in being known, more entirely himself. The dry humor was more present, surfaces more often, The intelligence had more room. The essential kindness which she had seen from the first but which had been careful and rationed, was now easy and regular, in the way he spoke with his men and with the town and with the children of Redemption Creek and with her. He laughed more. Not often but genuinely, the laugh of someone who had remembered that laughter was a thing they were allowed. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and long, and she spent it large with pregnancy and still teaching. Because Miss Barlow had returned to her full duties and was managing the school, but the schoolroom remained a place, Violet went several times a week to work alongside the children, who accepted her changing shape with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children have for the biological facts of life. The baby, a boy, arrived in early June of 1885. He was born in the ranch house on a bright summer morning with the help of the town's doctor, a capable man named Dr. Elias Marsh, and Miss Barlow, who had apparently strong views about births and had installed herself in the house 2 days prior in case of early arrival. John spent the labor outside the bedroom door in a state of barely contained anxiety that Ernesto Cruz managed by keeping him supplied with coffee and the kind of steady and wordless company that the cook had a gift for. When the baby came and the doctor opened the door and said, "Healthy boy, Mr. Conroy, come meet your son," he walked into the room and his face was entirely beyond description. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small red face of his son, and then at Violet's tired and entirely luminous face, and then back at the baby, and Violet said, "Do you want to hold him?" He held out his arms and the doctor transferred the wrapped bundle, and John Conroy held his son with the careful, terrified tenderness of a man who has never held a newborn, and is aware that he has now been entrusted with the most important thing he will ever hold. And he looked at the baby's face for a long time, and then looked up at Violet, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. They named him Thomas William Conroy, Thomas for Violet's grandfather and William for no one in particular, except that it seemed to suit the face. Thomas was a good-natured baby who developed at a satisfying pace through the summer and into the fall of 1885. And he became within a few months the unofficial mascot of the Calhoun Ranch, carried regularly into view of the hands on Saturday mornings when the weather allowed, and received by Ernesto with a delight that exceeded anything Ernesto showed for anything else, including his cooking, which he was rightly proud of. John was a father the way he was everything else, with complete attention and no performance. He was not the kind of man who made declarations about fatherhood. He simply changed the way he organized his days to ensure that he was present in the hours that mattered, the early mornings and the evenings, the hours that small children are most entirely themselves. He was careful and gentle with the baby in a way that Violet observed with a tenderness she could barely contain, and she thought about the man his father had been, closed and difficult, and felt a quiet and fierce joy at the break in the pattern. Miss Barlow retired from the school in the fall of 1886, gracefully and with full planning, and Violet took over the full position permanently. It was a decision that had been building for some time and was the right one. She had, in 2 years, become as much a fixture of Redemption Creek's life as the school building itself, and her tenure there was shaped by the same qualities she brought to everything: deep attention, honest assessment, fierce advocacy for the children in her care. The valley was changing around her during these years. The railroad reached the territory in 1880 and was continuing to spread, and the nearest line was now close enough to make the isolation of Redemption Creek less absolute than it had been. New families arrived. The town grew by small increments. A second general store opened, which caused some tension with the Hendersons before everyone settled into the acknowledgement that the town was large enough for two. A doctor's office opened as a proper establishment rather than the previous arrangement of Dr. Marsh working out of his house. John Conroy, in this growing place, occupied a position that had changed significantly from the one he had held when Violet arrived. He was still private by nature and still not a man who filled every space with words, but the fortress was gone, and what remained was a man who was known in his community, trusted for his judgment and his fairness, and present in the way that men become present when they have something worth being present for. He was called on increasingly to resolve disputes, not in any official capacity, but because he had the kind of reputation for straightforward honesty that made people trust his reading of a situation. A boundary dispute between two neighboring ranchers in the summer of 1886 came to him because both parties trusted him equally, and he worked it out in an afternoon by reading the original land survey and identifying a surveying error that had caused the dispute in the first place. And the resolution was clean, and both parties left satisfied, which was a result not often achieved in such matters. Violet watched him handle this and others like it with a quiet appreciation for the irony that the most difficult man to read in the valley had become its most reliable reader of situations. She told him this one evening, and he gave her the dry, quiet look she loved. "Knowing you were right about me from the start," he said, "has not stopped being unsettling. Would you prefer I had been wrong?" He considered the question with full seriousness, which was one of the things about him she loved most, the complete seriousness with which he engaged with even the playful questions. "No," he said, "I would not prefer it. Being seen was the beginning of everything worth having." She leaned over and kissed him, and Thomas, who was a year old and beginning to have opinions about adult attention that did not include him, made an indignant sound from his corner, and they both laughed. The second pregnancy was announced in the spring of 1887, and this time John received the news with something considerably closer to joy and considerably less terror than the first time, which she took as evidence of growth and told him so. The second child, also a boy, arrived in November of 1887. His name was James Robert Conroy, and he was a louder and more immediately demanding baby than his brother had been, which seemed to surprise John, who had categorized Thomas as the standard by which babies were measured, and had to recalibrate. Thomas, at 2 years old, received his brother with the curious proprietary suspicion of an oldest child encountering competition for the first time. He stood by the cradle for a long time on the first day and then announced, in the serious and precise way he had inherited from both of his parents, "He is very small." "You were that small once," Violet told him. Thomas considered this information. Was father frightened? Violet looked at John, who was behind Thomas and whose face was doing several things at once. "He was," she said truthfully, "but he was brave about it." Thomas nodded with the gravity of a 2-year-old who finds this satisfactory. James grew into a child of tremendous energy and considerable charm, and a relationship with mischief that kept everyone at the ranch in a state of mild alert. By the time he was old enough to follow Thomas around the ranch yard, the two of them together constituted a minor force of nature that Ernesto Cruz managed with a patience and a humor that confirmed the deep affection the cook had for the whole family. The school continued to grow and change under Violet's stewardship. The letter she had written on Sarah Prentice's behalf had, in the years since, opened a road that had been walked by 3 subsequent students, all of them children whose potential exceeded what a small valley school could contain, all of them given a path by Violet's willingness to advocate and document and write letters and push against the assumption that where you started was where you ended. Sarah Prentice wrote to her teacher from St. Louis in the fall of 1887, a long and wonderful letter full of the details of her first semester at the preparatory program, the classes and the other students and the city itself, and ending with, "I would not be here without you. I know that. I will not forget it." Violet kept the letter with the other important papers, in the wooden box that held their marriage certificate and Thomas's birth record and the note that had come with the Shakespeare on Christmas morning, 4 years past. In the spring of 1888, John Conroy received a letter from Denver. It was from the Calhoun family's principal representative, a man named Hayes, and it contained an offer. The family was considering dividing their western holdings and offering the Redemption Creek Ranch property for sale at a price that, while significant, was not beyond the reach of a man who had managed a large ranch for 8 years with careful stewardship of his own wages and the investment of those wages over time. He brought the letter to Violet on a Sunday evening without having read it twice, which was itself a measure of how far he had come from the man who processed everything alone before presenting a finished conclusion. She read it. She set it down. She looked at him. "Do you want to buy it?" she asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "But it is our life, not mine. So I am asking you." She was quiet for a moment. "Can we afford it?" He walked her through the numbers, carefully and completely, the way he had learned to share the things that mattered. It would require most of their savings and a bank loan at a reasonable rate that the bank in the nearest large town would likely advance given his track record with the property. It was manageable. It was not reckless. "The Calhoun name comes off the front gate," she said. "Yes," he said, "and it becomes the Conroy Ranch. If you are willing." She thought about the bare walls that had acquired pictures, and the single chair by the window where a very private man had sat and told her things he had told no one, and the view from the north pasture that was the best in the valley, and the stove that Ernesto managed with great skill, and the garden she had planted in the back with herbs and flowers, and the 2 small boys asleep in the upstairs room, and she thought, "This has been home for a long time." "Write to Hayes," she said. "Make the offer." The negotiation took 2 months and was settled in the summer of 1888. The day the deed transferred was a Saturday, and John came in from the land office with the signed document and set it on the kitchen table, and Violet looked at it and at him and said, "It is ours." "Ours," he said, and the word held something extraordinary in his voice, the still slightly wondering quality of a man who had spent a long time in a life that felt provisional and is still adjusting to the reality of permanence. She reached up and put her hands on his face, both of them, and held it, and he put his hands over hers, and they stood like that for a moment in the kitchen of the house they had just made irrevocably their own. The sign above the gate was changed the following week. Thomas, at 3, was allowed to watch and tried to explain to James, at 8 months, what the change signified. James, at 8 months, was not in a position to receive this information but seemed satisfied by the attention. Redemption Creek, in the late 1880s, was not the quiet, isolated valley it had been when Violet arrived in 1883. The territory was changing, the world was changing, the long push of settlement and commerce and politics that was reshaping the West moving through every corner of it. The railroad brought goods and people, and the kind of change that was neither entirely good nor entirely bad but was irrevocable. Old patterns gave way to new ones. Some of what was lost was worth grieving. Much of what arrived was worth welcoming. Within the valley's own community, the changes were navigated with the particular combination of practicality and decency that Violet had always found in the best of small communities. When a dispute arose between a long-settled Anglo family and a Mexican family over water rights to an irrigation ditch, it was brought to the sheriff and to John Conroy and to the land office, and examined by all 3, and the records showed that the Mexican family, the Rodriguezes, who had been in the valley longer than any Anglo settler, had a valid prior claim that had not been acknowledged when the Anglo family arrived. John Conroy wrote the assessment that went to the county office, and it was unambiguous. The Rodriguezes received their right. There was bitterness from one party and relief from the other, and the valley absorbed both and moved forward. Violet wrote about this in a letter to her mother, about what it meant to live in a place where the right thing was done even when it was complicated, and her mother wrote back, "It sounds as though you have found not just a good man but a good place. I am glad." The third pregnancy, announced in the winter of 1889, produced a daughter in the summer of 1890, a girl named Clara Ann Conroy, whose arrival was received by Thomas and James with the distinct and somewhat dramatic reactions of boys encountering a sister for the first time. Thomas, 5 years old, considered his sister with the same solemn gravity he applied to most things, and announced that she was acceptable. James, too, and considerably more interested in touching things than in assessing them, had to be redirected several times from the cradle. Clara Ann turned out to have her father's pale gray eyes and her mother's particular quality of attention, and by the time she could sit up and look around, she was doing exactly that, observing everything with a focused calm that made Ernesto say she was going to be exactly like her mother, which he said as the highest compliment available to him. John Conroy held his daughter on the day she was born with the ease of a man who had done this before and did not need to learn his hands into gentleness. They already knew it. He looked at her face for a long time and then at Violet and said, "She is going to figure everyone out before they know what she is doing. Is that concerning?" Violet asked, meaning it as a tease. "Terrifying," he said, meaning it as a compliment. They laughed together in the room where their daughter had just arrived in the world, and the summer light came through the good curtains that Violet had hung, the ones that let the light in rather than absorbing it, and fell across the boards of a home that was fully and irrevocably theirs. The years turned as years do, each one both the same as and different from the last. The children grew in the way that children grow, with the peculiar combination of gradualness and suddenness that means you blink and a baby is a toddler and blink again, and a toddler is a boy who can manage a horse and articulate opinions about things. Thomas at 7 was reading the same way his mother read, with total absorption and retention, and John had sat one evening watching his son with a book and said to Violet very quietly, "He reads the way you look at people." "He does," she said. "You terrify me slightly when you do that," he said. "I know," she said, "but only slightly." "Only slightly now," he agreed. "You used to terrify me rather more." James at 5 was already showing a physical capability and a practical confidence, with animals that suggested he was going to be the one who understood the ranch in his bones from earliest life, the one who would be at home in the saddle and the open land. He followed his father through the work of the ranch on the days when his legs were long enough to keep up, and John let him come and never shortened the explanations, talking to his son about the work with the same seriousness he applied to it himself, and James absorbed it with the earnest intensity of a child who has found his natural territory. Violet watched this parallel and thought about fathers. About John's father, the hard and closed man who had produced a hard and closed son, who had taken decades to open and yet had opened completely, had turned the pattern in his hands and looked at it and decided to do something different with his children. And about her own father, a gentle and bookish man who had given her the love of learning and the conviction that asking questions was the point of existence, and who had died when she was 17, and whose absence she had carried quietly all these years. She told John about her father on an evening in the fall of 1891 when the children were all asleep and they were sitting on the porch in the cool air, the way they often ended evenings, the stars enormous over the high desert. She had been thinking about him because Thomas had asked a question that morning that her father would have asked, the same quality of question, reaching for the mechanism behind the visible. John listened to all of it. The way her father had smelled like tobacco and old paper. The shelf of books he had built for her when she was 6, exactly to her height, so she could reach the top shelf on her own. The afternoon he died, the absolute and total unreadability of a world without him. When she was done, John was quiet for a moment and then he said, "He would have liked you here." "Here," she said. "In this valley, in this life." He looked at the stars. "He would have liked what you built." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the solid reality of him beside her and thought, this is what it means to be known by someone. Not just to be seen, but to have someone who holds what you show them with the care it deserves. "He would have liked you," she said. "He would have been polite about me," John said, with the dry precision that was entirely his. before eventually deciding I was worth keeping. She laughed, the full and genuine laugh that he had been producing in her with increasing regularity over the years of their life together. "He would have liked you immediately," she said firmly. "He had the same gift I have." "God help me," John said, and she felt him smile against her hair. Clara Ann at 3 had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them, which was both delightful and somewhat formidable. She had settled into a particular attachment to her father that had the quality of an extremely firm editorial choice. She would accept being carried by her mother, appreciated it even, but being carried by her father was the acknowledged apex of available experience, and she made this preference known with the complete absence of social tact available to 3-year-olds. John, who had spent years being entirely certain he was not a man who made attachments, was entirely attached to his daughter. This was not something he would have said directly. What he did instead was move through the days in such a way that a daughter who wanted to be near him found him consistently accessible and engaged, which amounted to the same thing. The ranch in the early 1890s was a thriving enterprise. The cattle herd had grown with careful management. 2 additional hands had been hired. The house had been expanded, a bedroom added on the east side for when the children needed the space. The garden in the back was now a proper kitchen garden, plus a small section of purely decorative flowers that had started with Violet and had been enthusiastically expanded by Clara Ann, who had developed a deep conviction that flowers were the correct answer to most problems. Sheriff Walt Aldridge retired in 1891, and the town held an election for his replacement. 3 men stood. The community approached John Conroy about standing, through a delegation that included Chester Henderson, Reverend Baines, and 3 ranchers from the outlying spreads. He discussed it with Violet over 2 evenings, and she said she thought he would be excellent at it, and that the decision was his to make. And he said he thought he would be better placed doing what he was doing, that a man who ran the largest ranch in the valley had a different kind of influence than a man who held a badge, and that influence served the community without the particular complications of office. He was right, she thought, though she did not say it quite that directly, not wanting to lead the answer. He was right because the way he helped his community worked precisely, because it was not official, because it had no coercive power behind it, only the power of his judgment and the trust that his judgment had earned. The new sheriff was a competent man named Peters, and he and John developed a useful working relationship, and the valley was well served by both. In the spring of 1893, Violet received a letter from Edmund Vane, the man she had refused in Cincinnati, 9 years prior and half a continent away. It was a careful and decent letter. He had married 3 years after she left, a woman he described as wonderful and with whom he was, he wrote, genuinely happy. He had been in correspondence with someone in the territory on a legal matter, and the name Redemption Creek had come up, and he had thought of her and wanted to extend the kind of peaceful greeting that time and happiness can make possible. She read the letter twice and then told John about it over dinner, because it was the kind of thing she told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you glad you said no?" "Absolutely," she said. "Are you glad I said no?" "Absolutely," he said, and his voice held the same absolute quality it had held on their wedding day, the kind of certainty that is the permanent record of a person who has decided and is done deciding. She folded the letter and put it aside, not in the wooden box with the important papers, in the kitchen drawer with the string and the extra candles. It did not belong with the important things. It was simply a postcard from a road she had not taken, filed under things that did not matter much, because the road she had taken led here. Thomas Conroy, at 9, was beginning to demonstrate a seriousness about his schoolwork that suggested Violet was going to be in the business of writing the kind of letters she had written for Sarah Prentice, and sooner rather than later. He had his father's focused intelligence and his mother's precise observation, and the combination was, in a child, both remarkable and sometimes slightly alarming to his teachers. Miss Barlow, now retired but not absent from the school's orbit, said that Thomas Conroy was the most interesting student she had seen in 40 years of teaching, which she said directly to the boy himself, who received it with the same gravity he received everything. James at 7 was the opposite, not in any deficiency, but in direction. His school work was solid and his reading was good, and he applied himself when the application was required, but his real education was happening in the fields and the pastures, with the horses and the cattle and the land that would one day be his to steward. John recognized this about him and shaped the ranch work accordingly, teaching his younger son not just the tasks, but the understanding underneath them. Clara Ann at 4 was a law unto herself. She attended the first year of school in the fall of 1894, and her teacher, Violet herself, navigated the interesting terrain of being both this child's mother and her instructor, with a carefully maintained separation that required more discipline from Violet than it did from Clara, who simply behaved the same way in both settings, with absolute confidence and occasional magnificence. In the evening of a September day in 1894, sitting on the porch in the warmth that still lasted through September evenings, John Conroy said to Violet, with the quiet directness that was entirely his, "I was thinking about the store. The first day you arrived." She turned to look at him. "What about it?" "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about what I was before you, what I had made of myself in the name of protection, and what it cost, not just me, the people I kept at a distance, the community I moved through like a ghost for 4 years." He looked at the mountains in the last light. "I want you to know that I understand the cost now in a way I could not have then." She was very still. "John, I am not made for easy expression," he said. "I know you know that. But I want to say directly, because saying things directly is what you taught me and I believe in it, that I am aware you are the reason I became a person worth knowing." He looked at her. "You saw something true in me before I was willing to see it in myself, and then you were patient enough to wait for me to come to it on my own road." He paused. "That is a rare thing, a very rare thing." She reached out and took his hand. "I saw who you already were," she said. "I did not make you into anything. I just made it safe to be what you already were." He looked down at their joined hands and then back up at the mountains. "Same thing," he said softly. The stars came out over Redemption Creek in the September dark, and the children were asleep inside, and the mountains held their ancient shape against the sky, and nothing was hidden between them, not a single thing. And the quiet between them was not the quiet of a man who had made a fortress of silence, but the quiet of two people who had learned to share their silences the same way they shared everything else, with the ease and the intention of a long and truthful love. The valley had named him the hardest man to read in the entire territory. He had earned that name over years of careful construction, every wall precisely maintained, every expression managed, every distance calculated. He had been so certain that the fortress would hold, that the practice would eventually become perfect, that someday even he would not be able to find the thing inside the walls. And then a woman had stepped off a stage in a dust-brown town in New Mexico territory in the fall of 1883, and she had looked at him for 6 seconds and she had known. The terror of that knowing had been real. He would not have denied it. It had been perhaps the most frightening moment of his adult life, not the gun confrontation in the general store, not the moment she had spoken the 7 words that shook every wall he had, but the 6 seconds before all of that on the main street, when she had looked at him and he had seen in her eyes that she already understood, and he had realized that the one thing he had always feared most had happened without any consent from him at all. He had been seen, and it had not destroyed him. It had done the opposite. It had been, as he had told her on a flat rock in February sun, the most relief he had felt in a very long time. She had been right about everything. She had been right about the loneliness and the fear and the damage and the need. She had also been right when she made her own confession on that same flat rock about what had brought her to Redemption Creek. She had needed the distance. She had needed the unknown. She had needed a place where she did not yet know everything, and where there was still something large and uncharted to learn. He had been the most unreadable man in the valley, and she had read him correctly in the first 6 seconds, and the reading had been an act of love before either of them had the name for it. Their life was not without difficulty. No life is. There were hard seasons on the ranch, a drought year that tested the herd and required difficult decisions, a winter that was colder than any in memory. There was the grief of Miss Barlow's death in 1895, attended by the whole town and mourned with genuine and open sorrow by Violet, who had lost in her a colleague and a friend of the best kind. There was the distant hard news of John's only surviving sibling, a brother in Missouri, dying of fever in 1896, a death that brought the old grief about the father and the family of origin back to the surface briefly, and was mourned as it deserved to be mourned. But each of these difficulties moved through a life that was structurally sound, rooted in the honesty and the attention, and the deep dailiness of a love that had been built carefully and completely, and the structure held. By the turn of the century, the Conroy Ranch was an established institution of Redemption Creek, and John and Violet Conroy were the kind of couple that a small community builds its sense of its own possibilities around. Not because they were perfect, but because they were genuinely themselves, because they had managed the rare thing of becoming more fully who they were in the presence of each other rather than less. Thomas, at 16, was reading law books borrowed from the county seat. James, at 14, was already more useful on the ranch than most grown men. Clara Ann, at 12, was teaching herself to draw the mountain views from the porch in charcoals, with a precision and an eye that stopped people when they saw the results. On an evening in the fall of 1900, the whole family was on the porch after dinner, the September dark coming in over the mountains and the first stars appearing in the deep blue sky. Violet was reading. John was doing nothing in particular, which he had learned over the years to do without guilt. Thomas had a book. James was testing the edge on a pocket knife with the focused attention he gave to practical things. Clara Ann was watching the first stars appear with the attentiveness that was entirely her mother's. "Papa," Clara Ann said. "Yes," John said. "Did you know right away about Mama?" John looked at his daughter, this girl with his eyes and her mother's particular quality of observation, and he looked over at Violet, who had looked up from her book, and they shared a look across their children and across 16 years of shared life. "No," he said honestly. "Your mother knew right away about me." He paused. "It took me longer." "How long?" Clara Ann asked. "Long enough to be embarrassing," he said, and Violet laughed, the full and genuine laugh, and Thomas looked up from his book, and even James paused in the knifework to look. "But not too long?" Clara Ann asked. "No," John said, looking at his wife. "Not too long." The stars came all the way out over Redemption Creek, brilliant and enormous in the desert sky, and the mountains held their ground in the dark. And on the porch of a house they had made into a home together, Violet Atwood Conroy and John Conroy sat in the comfortable and permanent closeness of two people who had chosen each other well, who had been honest with each other completely, and who had built from honesty something that would last as long as they would. And likely longer in the children it had made and the community it had shaped, and the small and large acts of true attention it had sent out into the world. She had read him correctly in the first 6 seconds. He had been terrified by it. It was the best thing that had ever happened to either of them.